All right, folks, it's time for another edition of the radio show with Mark Lee here on Pod TV and all along those lines. So we've got some great conversations, and I'm looking forward to one today. Hope everybody is trying to stay very much in the dry period. We had Helene come through and do some damage earlier, and they're talking about some other weather and maybe even some other storms coming our way as well. But hopefully they will not come that way and all in that space. But they never can tell here in Durham, North Carolina, where I'm based, and all along those lines, because sometimes we are in the middle of the storm tracks and all in that kind of way. So we're going to see what happens in that regards. And I know that I'm going to start following the some things on sports, including the race for the pennant, because I am a Marquette graduate, and I know that the gentleman I'm going to be talking to has got some ties, and it was actually in the discovery of his father had some things that he did with the Catholic Church, and all along those lines. So being a Marquette grad, I am a fan of the Milwaukee Brewers. Really wasn't that big into baseball until I went to school, and have been a Brewers fan ever since those days back in the 80s. Haven't done that much damage, but hey, they could surprise us and maybe even win something this year. They've got some strong players, but we're going to see if that's the case or not. Hopefully they're going to do better than my fantasy football team, which is now fallen to 0-4. So I don't think I'll be winning any money in fantasy football anytime soon, but maybe my Brewers will have some luck in that regards. But I've got David Tereshchuk with me, and David has written a book about looking for some of the people in his life, including his own father, and all along those lines. And of course, he's also been involved in the media space, so he may have some thoughts about some of the things that are going on in this area, because I'm actually very curious to ask him about the rural and city divide, because that is something that I saw on one of his posts sometimes back when he was trying to figure out who would be Harris's vice president. And I think he picked somebody that I thought was going to be the one as well, but they wound up picking somebody else, and those debates will be taking place on tomorrow. But I'm going to bring in David and see about this book that he's got and all along those lines. So how are you doing, David? I know you've got this whole book called A Question of Fraternity, because apparently you've got an extensive media background, something I share with you because I went to school back in the 80s, and when I was at Marquette, one of my professors was George Wills, who was actually the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson back in the day, and he was one of my professors at Marquette, so I definitely learned something about journalism at his hand before he passed away several years back and all along those lines. But I'm sure you probably remember that particular gentleman as well as other ones as well. So if you just want to share a little bit about your background in journalism, because I am definitely in journalism. My parents actually started a radio station in rural North Carolina in 1976. It was on for about 11 years because they were frustrated by the lack of coverage of minority issues, the lack of coverage of certain important issues like environmental concerns and race concerns and other things. And they were lovers of jazz and blues and other types of music that they weren't hearing. So without any background in that field, they decided to start their own radio station, and that radio station lasted for a number of years and helped my parents go on to their various careers. In some cases, well, like with my dad, still active in his career as a artist, not so much as the activist that he used to be. And mom is retired as the first president of the Golden Leaf Foundation, which was some of that tobacco settlement money and all along those lines. But definitely, you'll share a little bit about your own background.
Well, thanks, Mark. Good to be on your show. I'm glad you could have me. Well, I come from a very different background, I guess. I come from the border country between England and Scotland. I grew up in a small village, no, a small town or a big village, depending on how you might define it. Very close to the border, actually just on the English side, but the border moved around over time in history. So, you know what historians call that area? They called it the debatable land. I mean, but it was more than just debated about. It was fought over, where the English and the Scottish and, you know, battles raged for centuries. But that label has stuck. And there's a certain kind of uncertainty about identity, national identity there. And I certainly had a lot of uncertainty about identity in other ways too, because I grew up the son of a young girl who conceived me when she was 15 years old, and thereby hangs a story. And that's what the story of my book, A Question of Paternity, is all about, because I never knew who my father was. And this was a big dark secret in my house. My grandmother, who presided over the house, was She was the head of the household, and there was great scandal about my birth. We were poor. We lived in public housing, and to add to that, there was this shame. I guess shame descended on our household about my appearance.
Wow.
My mother was 16 when I was born, and a deal was done, I suppose. I was allowed into the house. First of all, my mother was sent away almost 200 miles for me to be born. Such was the way society then, and certainly in this context, looked upon teenage pregnancies. And I was born all that distance away, and my mother was allowed back into the house with me on certain terms and conditions laid down by my grandmother. One was that my mother would stop going to high school. She was one of the few people in our family who had that degree of education. Most people stopped earlier than high school age. And the deal was that she would go out to work and become our family's only breadwinner. And the other condition was that this strange story was concocted. Well, it's not so strange. It's quite common in families in this situation, certainly amongst working class families like us. But it seemed, in retrospect, to be very strange to me. And again, that uncertainty would cloud everything, because the story would be that I was not my mother's son, but my grandmother's last son. Now, she was well past childbearing age. I don't know how they thought they could get away with this story. And my grandfather was off the scene. He had died some years before I was born. But somehow or other, this was felt more acceptable than having me acknowledged as the son of a 16-year-old girl. And everybody in the household called my grandmother Mam, the Scottish equivalent for Mom. I called her Mom. I thought she was my mom. And my sister, I called by her first name as if she was my elder sister. My mother, I should have said. My actual real mother, I regarded as my sister, called her Hilda, that was her name. And there were two other youngsters in the household, two young boys who were playmates to me, and they seemed, to all intents and purposes, my brothers, but they were, in fact, of course, my uncles. So that was the situation in which I was initially brought up.
Well, along those same lines, you bring up a couple of very interesting points and everything. But how much? At what point did you decide that you wanted to go find your natural father and all along those lines? And was that journey like I said, I did do some of that research, and I understand that it includes everything from the Red Cross to the Catholic Church to a number of other things that were part of the journey in terms of discovering this person and everything. And did I'm assuming other members of your family knew who the natural father was and everything, and maybe they had sent him away, because I do know that that is a common practice in certain societies and all along those lines. But I was just wondering, um, what was their reaction? Did they have a conversation with the boy's family that was you later found out to be your father and everything? So how did this all transpire from what you learned from your own family dynamics?
Well, in our family dynamics, Mark, nobody talked about it. I don't know what people knew or didn't know. There was silence in our household about lots of things, but there was a very big and strong silence maintained about who my father might be. I don't recall ever asking the question, "Who's my dad? Why is there no dad in this household?" I don't remember ever asking that, and I suspect I don't want to be a big self-analysis merchant, but I have no psychiatric qualifications, but I have a strong sneaking feeling that I was warned off the topic as a child. I was somehow or other, maybe I don't remember, as I say, anything ever being said out loud about it, but I think I learned, and I learned very deeply, that this was a topic we didn't go anywhere near. And for the longest time, I did not go near it. I didn't go near it as a kid. I didn't go near it later when I acquired a father of sorts. I acquired a stepfather when my mother finally did marry. Uh, he's the reason I have an Eastern European name, although I'm Scottish or borderland English Scottish. And at that point, too, the whole question, who was my real father, never came up because I never went near the topic. And I didn't do so for an awful long time. I had other things on my mind. I I wanted to carve out a career in the media, as you've said, and I did so, and that was my biggest dedication. I wasn't concerned about my paternity at that point. I think the story I told myself is that it didn't matter. I didn't care. It wasn't important, and that remained the case for quite a long time until I was in my 40s when things changed. I changed countries. I changed my whole outlook. I got married for the first time in my life in my early 40s. And I think I got to the point where I wanted to banish secrecy from my life. And, uh, and I wanted to address the question. And then I started asking the question to my mother, and she avoided the topic. She evaded the issue for some time before finally telling me uh, a shocking story that just knocked me sideways.
Wow.
Uh, she told me in a conversation she had in the year 2001, a big signal, important, significant year for lots of people. But in my case, this personal family matter was the most important thing. And she told me that at the age of 15, she'd been raped by a Catholic priest. And that was a stunning story to me. And it set me off on a search using all the tools I possibly could muster as an investigative journalist, which I was for much of my career, to try and find out who this priest might have been who raped my mother at the age of 15. A crime, of course, a sexual assault by a priest against a minor, a 15-year-old. It had to be exposed. I mean, I wanted to know who the man was for my own private reasons, but I thought that this was a shocking crime that needed to be revealed, exposed, investigated, and perhaps, you never know, if the man was still alive, maybe he should answer for it. But that search became rather complicated and certainly very lengthy, and it fills out the main drift of my book, conducted against a background of all the momentous moments of 20th and 21st century history that I witnessed as a journalist.
Yeah, along those same lines and everything, because I know that we were talking earlier today on World Edition, which is our daily news show and everything about the Pope and his visits to certain countries, and he had even brought up, I think it was when he was in Belgium, if memory is serving me correctly, and everything, this notion of the dark side of the Catholic Church. And like I said, I did go to a Jesuit university, and all along those lines, and I think he was saying that they need to have some have some consequences for their acts and everything if they were involved in some of the abuses that not just the Catholic Church but other churches have had as well. So did you find yourself running into a lot of brick walls? Because I do know that sometimes it can be a very difficult conversation for people to have, whether it is in the church environment or in some of the sports environments where we've seen this happen as well. So was it a difficult conversation when you tried to bring it up to the church elders?
Well, I was very careful. Investigative journalists know that there are lots of ways that organizations of authority can put blockages in your way. I, by a strange irony, I was something of a specialist in church matters or religion matters or ethical matters in general. For the British commercial TV network, I was in charge of a department that made programs about nothing else. So for a while, I cultivated quite a lot of contacts in that world, and I used those contacts to a great deal, to a great extent, to help me in what were very discreet inquiries to begin with. Everybody who was expert in the Catholic Church, and certainly the Catholic Church was going through a period of, probably that period still lasts, of priests being exposed as sexual predators. And when that happened, the church at that point had accrued quite a track record of covering the story up, or taking priests from one parish where they might have committed an offense, and moving them somewhere else, sometimes in the same diocese, sometimes in an entirely different diocese, and thus enabling them, in some cases, to start offending all over again. So, in general terms, the church had developed a technique, or a range of techniques, for covering their tracks, as it were. So I was not going to do what in my trade we call an front door approach, knocking on the front door and asking the question. I did a lot of internal undercover work, if you like, using contacts that I had in the church and in British law enforcement too, that helped me quite a bit to try and track down this man who might have who was allegedly, according to my mother, the man who raped her, and that was a difficult exercise. It there were various routes we could follow. Um, some looked very promising at first. Uh, my mother had named the priest. As far as she knew, he was called Father Francis, she said. And to begin with, we not initially, it took some time for this to emerge, but it did turn out that there was a priest who sort of fitted the bill. And he disappeared from the parish he was assigned to um, around about the time I was born, the very same month, in fact. And he disappeared from church records for a while, and then reappeared elsewhere in the diocese, still in the diocese, but a long distance away. And his name was different when he reappeared. He was no longer Father Francis. He went by the name of Father Leo. He had a middle name. That was the cover story, if you can think in those terms, if it's fair to do so. He was both Leo and Francis, but he became known as, according to the church, he became known as Father Leo, no longer Father Francis, and he did seem to be the man who might have fathered me. We tracked him down in terms of his movements historically, and found that he'd died. Um, and he'd ended up living in a coastal resort. I think it would have been a retirement place for him. And then things took a different turn. The modern science of genetics entered the stage, and DNA matches, a big and popular means of connecting with people who are related to you. And I had given my uh, genes, my DNA sample, to something like 10 or 11 of these genealogy DNA based websites that are become very popular, ancestry.com, myheritage.com, uh, 23andMe, about the number of genes on a chromosome, and others like that. So in the end, my DNA was being compared because of the miracle of algorithmic research, trolling and crawling through all these databases. My DNA was being compared with something like 12 million people's DNA, and and the other thing, of course, that immediately happened when we were concentrating on this particular priest who had died and seemed to fit the bill, is that very close relatives of his happened to have put their DNA into one of these databases too. So it was publicly available and could be compared with mine. And guess what? No match at all possible. There was no way that I could be related to this priest. So this was a lead that came to a complete dead end.
Well, so did you after that one? Because I think that at some point the Red Cross got involved as well. So did you ever find out who the particular father was, or is that still something that you are looking at? And if I can just kind of get a sideway question to that, because you mentioned that you got married late in life, and my brother did the same thing. Because I've got two nephews that are 15 and 16, and he'll turn 55 this year and everything. So he was 39 when he had his first child, and that was either his second or fourth marriage, the second and third marriage, and everything. But I do know that sometimes when you are dating, because I've definitely been in that world and everything, that people like to know your family history. So I was just wondering, was that a problematic thing even when you got married to your, I'm assuming now wife and everything? But I do know that a lot of times people want to know both your heritage, but like your immediate heritage, your immediate family, but they also want to know like your father, mother, grandparents, and all of that and everything. So it did become an issue even in your early relationships.
I'm not quite sure what the question was, Mark.
I'm guessing what I'm asking is in your both job and personal life and friend life and dating life, did you find that a lot of people were as curious as you were? Because I do know that a lot of times that's one of the things people want to know is people's family history, and it seems like me that part of what you
Uh,
were lacking
well,
was
I kept my family history a pretty deep secret. I didn't talk about this to anybody else. I mean, it was a matter of great shame. I knew at the back of my mind, but I dismissed it as an irrelevancy, and I certainly would never talk about it with people to people that I was in relationships with, and my relationships tended to be rather short, and I was a difficult person to live with, I think. And when I finally did get married, things were very different. My wife and I, my late wife, she died a few years ago now, but my wife was very eager and supported me enormously in my search for the true identity on my father's side. We knew everything about my mother's side, and we talked about that all the time. But there was this great mystery about my father and who he might be. And my wife, Melissa, was enormously supportive of my desperate, well, not desperate, but very steady and determined search that I put in. But of course, when I got to the point where the prime suspect, if you can call him, the priest that we'd identified, turned out not to be in any way, shape, or form related to me genetically, we had to go on a different search. And as you say, it ended up involving even the Red Cross, which is remarkable. That was because when all these millions of people's DNA was being compared to mine, every now and again, a connection, a match would come up with someone in Germany. Not a very close match. Sort of, there would be people who could be second or third cousin to me, perhaps, but we clearly had a common ancestor somewhere way back there, and maybe this was a way to find someone who, in their family trees, might have been in Britain at the right time, and might have fathered me in one sense only. And that was the new set of leads that we had to follow up, and it got repeated several times over, German matches with mine. So we started to look at the possibility of Germans in our neck of the woods, and sure enough, there was a prisoner of war camp. Britain had something like 1,100 prisoner of war camps scattered around the country during World War II. And there was one right outside our village, number 692, that's what it was, Camp 692. And there were prisoners of war there during the war, of course, but then also, and this was the interesting thing, um, for years afterwards, uh, Italian prisoners of war and German prisoners of war were in this camp. The Germans, in particular, were not repatriated to their own home country for several years, right up until 1948, the year I was born. Interestingly enough, there were still prisoners of war at our village. They were no longer confined in a tight, secure way. But they had to obey rules, and they had a curfew and so on. But they did work around the village. They helped out on the local farms. So they were, in a sense, part of the community. So there was another area for us to start searching. And interestingly enough, we ended up with some evidence to show that two elders of the village, if you like, two elderly people who were in their 90s when I came across them, could remember that my mother was indeed, in the country phrase of the time, walking out with a German prisoner of war. They even had a name for him. Both remembered him as being called Rudy, first name only, but that's the name we had. And it's possible that in this relationship with my mother, he ended up fathering me. So that was the new possibility that I had to search for, this time in Germany.
And did you find Mr. Rudy and any evidence that that was the actual person, or are we still looking for the search goes on and everything, or is there possibility that it is Rudy, or how does the story continue?
Well, I go into that in great detail in the book, and I hope people will read that. And I don't want to give too much away, that will spoil it for people reading the book. But let's say that the search continues, and it's been a devilishly long search, and it's gotten very detailed at times, and it's gotten distracted by other happenings. But we're still in the process of narrowing it down to who the real man might be.
What advice do you give? Because that is something that a lot of people go through, whether it is because of fostering or whether it's because of situations like your mother went through and everything, or a number of other reasons. But that I do know that it has been a common conversation around various cultures and everything, where people are trying to figure out their identity, whether it's looking for their father or whatever other, maybe even both of their parents and everything. So when you have heard about this as a journalist, what advice do you give for people that are going on that search, similar to the search that you've been going on?
Well, yes, adopted people are often engaged in a very similar sort of research, and I know it's difficult for them. Um, I'm not sure what advice I give. I think every case is individual. My case has been particularly frustrating in many ways for reasons that I'm not entirely certain about. I don't quite know why, for instance, people in Germany don't want to talk to me, even though it seems that in some way I'm related to them. I don't know what their story is. I don't know how that connects with me, and as I say, I'm frustrated by that. When people in somewhat similar situations to me are searching, I would only urge that you just keep on doing the search. Mine was lengthy and involved and complicated. I'm sure everyone's search would be fraught with difficulties. These are matters that seem to kick up a lot of secrecy, and many families' instant reaction is to cover things up and not be open about them. And if there's any one single message from my book, I think it's that secrets are toxic. Family secrets are toxic, and they need, in most cases. I mean, I can imagine some cases where this is not true, but in most cases, they should be opened up. People have a right to know, and asking the question is an important thing to do. I mean, I'm obviously bound to say that I'm a journalist. I ask questions for a living, but I would urge anyone who's troubled by a deep family secret is just keep asking the questions.
That makes a lot of sense, because actually a friend of mine is actually going to possibly build, not possibly, they will be launching a podcast here on the Pod TV network and everything, and they are actually using their family secrets to kind of like talk to women in general, but also have them kind of like learn from each other, because they were literally almost the opposite of what you went through, David, and everything. Because Nikki's the young lady's name, and she's launching a series because she was a child, and might be similar to your mother and everything. She was a child bride at 14. She got involved with a individual that was turned out to be somewhat abusive, but definitely gave her 4 kids that she still has a great deal of respect for, as well as 11 grandkids that she dotes over, and all along those lines. But she feels that there are life lessons that she can hopefully teach other people and everything based on what she went through. So I guess that would be a question I would ask you: is what are some of the life lessons that this has taught you, as well as just in general life lessons that others can learn, both from your experience here as well as your experience as a investigative journalist? Because I'm a big fan of life lessons, and like I said, I do know that sometimes people don't know what the hands they're going to be dealt in life. Because I'm sure that my friend Nikki was not expecting to be a mother at 14.
I can imagine. Yeah.
So, what kind of life lessons would you offer to folks, just in general and everything, based on what you have learned just in your research for this particular book?
Well, I'd say again that if you're troubled by a family secret that's weighing on you, um, it's a very good idea, in my experience at least, to just keep asking the questions and put as much effort as you can into discovering the truth. It'll be almost inevitable, I think, in many families that people will be reluctant to talk about it. Why would they? I mean, why? They would be bound to be reluctant, I think. Why have the secret in the first place? I mean, people who live with that kind of secret are the sort of people who want to keep it hidden. Otherwise, it wouldn't stay hidden, quite clearly. You'll encounter resistance if you go on a journey like this. But I think you just have to be persistent. And I have been persistent. And to be perfectly honest, I haven't got all the answers that I would have liked to have had. But the interesting thing is, in my case, I've ended up learning an awful lot more than I ever knew. And I don't know that absolute conclusive, ironclad truth that I think lies at the heart of all this. But perhaps I never will. And the one thing that I've learned along with this is that I've got some degree of acceptance with that. I deal in facts the whole time in my professional life, and I have a strong belief in truth and the ascertainable the ascertainability, if you like, of an actual hard truth. But I haven't got it in this case, and yet I've learned, I think, by now. To recognize that I can live with not actually knowing the absolute clear and undeniable truth. I've got a set of truths, and I'm comfortable having learned them. But I have still to live with a certain degree of uncertainty, and that's perfectly possible too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and everything. Because I know that part of your other background, we kind of alluded to this because you've definitely done it in Britain, definitely have done it for various people here in the United States and everything along those lines, is that you are an investigative journalist. I know that back when I was in school, I was actually motivated by Watergate and actually had thought about doing that kind of journalism myself. We've got David K. Johnson, who sometimes comes on this show, who is a fellow investigative journalist of yours and everything. So a lot of people might be surprised that one, that you were able to use the skills of investigative journalism, but then they might be surprised that you haven't come to the realization of the answer that you were expecting to get as of yet. That doesn't mean it won't come later and everything, because I'm sure that there are some people that even, I won't say give you pushback, but they probably are going like, he's an investigative journalist. He should be able to have the answer already and everything along those lines. So I just wondered your take on that, because I'm sure that when people find out that you're an investigative journalist and that you haven't uncovered this particular truth, this probably still throws them off to some degree.
Well, it's true. I haven't got the truth I was after. Not completely, not conclusively, not ironclad. And, maybe it's just a fact of life that some things are not ascertainable. And that's a truth in itself that I have to recognize and come to terms with. And honestly, in my own mind, I think I have come to terms with it. It's also just possible. I mean, the question is still open. It's perfectly possible that sometime, one fine day, a DNA result is going to pop up, probably a genealogical website with members in Germany. There's a very close match. And suddenly I'm able to look at that person's family tree and see that in that family tree there is a man who was in the UK in 1948 and in every way suits the definition of a close genetic match with me and could even be my father. It's possible. I'm open to that possibility, and I don't think I'm desperately in a search for it anymore. But I am open to a possibility, and I'm content to live with for the moment with the truths that I have managed to find.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What skills, if somebody was thinking, because we get all kinds of people that go watch these shows on Pod TV of various ages and various backgrounds, and yes, you can even decide to go into a new career later in life and everything. So, if somebody wanted to be an investigative journalist, what skills would you urge them to have and to develop? And do you think personally, because like I said, I did go to journalism school at Marquette, that our journalism schools in general are doing a good job of training the next future generation of investigative journalists?
Well, the basic quality needed, of course, is curiosity. It's surprising how many people who are not particularly curious about the life around them. But journalists need to be curious, obviously. And that quality I talked about a moment ago, persistence, that's really important. You can acquire certain skills, and journalism schools are a pretty good place to learn it. I didn't go to journalism school myself, but I ended up teaching in a journalism school, a pretty damn good one, Columbia School of Journalism here in New York City. And it is, and I wondered when I started teaching whether it was really possible to teach the skill of journalism to young people. And I discovered that despite my cynicism, and I can be a pretty cynical person sometimes, despite my cynicism, I found yes, it is possible to teach people journalism. And you can practice with them the art of asking the relevant question and then pursuing with the equally important thing, the second question, the follow up questions that are always important to get asked. And yes, I think most of the journalism schools that I know are doing a good job of turning out very skillful journalists. I'm very glad to say that my own crop of students still keep in touch with me. They're scattered all over the world now, all enjoying very useful careers, and they keep me posted with some of their advances and some of their setbacks. And it's great to see that journalism is a transmittable skill.
Yep, it's definitely a transmittable skill. I would agree with you on that and everything. And you mentioned NYU, but during the pandemic, I became friends with the gentleman that does the New York Times read along, and I think that he is a fellow person with your Columbia University and that New York journalism community. But that is Sri Srinivasan, who is very much involved in that community. But he literally, him and another gentleman, literally read the New York Times, and then will have commentaries. But become a very popular YouTube type show that existed during, I think it was even before the pandemic, and I think he was involved with the Met in terms of some of their PR work and all along those lines. But I know he's definitely a big fan of journalism and the journalism ethics and everything. But I was just wondering, in terms of ethics, do you think we're doing a good enough job and everything? Because I do know that that's something that we've heard a lot of discussions about, and I definitely want to get to media beat before we close out the show and everything. But do you think that journalists are doing a good job of being strong proponents of being ethical journalists? Because that's something I try to do, but I don't know that every journalist does, and it is something that the candidates have argued about in our political structures.
Well, I wish I could say that every journalist was a good one, but we know journalists. I mean, like every profession, it has people in it that don't necessarily go by a strong set of ethical values to guide them as they work. But I'm glad. And in my observation and my experience, they're the minority. There are, however, certain publications and certain outlets that claim the identity of journalism. They say they're journalistic outlets, and I'm not going to name any, but I question in my own mind whether they even know what journalism is. There's a certain, I mean, I know there's a trend of tabloidization that has been encouraged by social media too. In a way, social media has become a vast playground for tabloidism, if you can call it that, and that's not what I recognize as real journalism.
I agree with you on that and everything. I think I earlier said it was George Mills, but it was actually George Reedy was the one that I was trying to think of. There was the professor at Marquette and all along those lines. So if I misspoke, I wanted to correct myself and let folks know the actual name that I did remember my professor's name. But that was the one that was the LBJ press secretary way
Oh,
back.
you should always remember your professors' names. It's
Yes,
really important. I speak as an ex-professor. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. That's why I want to make sure that I said it correctly because he is somebody that definitely influenced me, along with one that taught that. And I do not remember their name because they were not as memorable in that sense. Because professors aren't always memorable, as you know as well. But there was one that kind of let you learn the creative writing side of journalism as well. Because in order to be a good writer, you have to have some of the same tricks as some of the creative novelist as well, and everything along those lines in terms of the sentence structure and in terms of some of the alliterations and other kind of novel tricks that can be there in journalism and everything. So, what kind of writing tricks would you give to your students when you were teaching them in terms of like writing hints?
Oh gosh, write simply is my basic message. Don't be complicated. Straightforward. Short sentences tend to be better than long sentences, but people can get away with long sentences sometimes if they're well crafted. Um, and yeah, that's just about it. Tell the truth and tell it briefly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Tell the truth. Tell it briefly. Tell me about media beats, because, like I said, I was fascinated, and one of the things I said I was going to get to you on when I saw that you were going to be a guest today was this notion about the divide. We're hearing a lot about the divide, both in terms of left and right. I would argue divide among the races, and one of your pieces you wrote about a divide that is very prominent here in North Carolina. It sometimes gets mentioned when we think about being a purple state, but I don't know it gets as much attention as it probably deserves, which is the divide between urban and rural. Because North Carolina definitely has a very active rural community, it has a very active urban community, but they are not oftentimes the same politically. Because our urban areas like Durham, where I'm at, and Chapel Hill to some, well, Chapel Hill definitely, and Charlotte to some degree, would be seen as more liberal bastions, whereas some of our rural towns are very much conservative bastions. And then, of course, you've got the suburbs and the mountains and other everything else here in North Carolina as well. So, can you just tell me a little bit about that divide and your research in that? Because that was one of the pieces that I read as you were at that time, I guess, trying to figure out who Kamala Harris would pick as her vice president. And it seemed like you were hinting that Mark Kelly, who I kind of agree with, would have been a good pick, not knocking Tim Waltz and everything, but it seemed on the piece that I read that you were hinting that Mark Kelly could have been a good pick, and I'm assuming because of Miss Gifford and other things as well. But just wondering your take on that rural and urban divide.
Well, it grows out of my commentary on the practice of journalism that I do in this weekly radio broadcast I do called themediabeat.com. It's also known as themediabeat.us because a lot of the time I am dealing with American politics, but I also look internationally too. And I'm very fond of Chapel Hill, by the way. I think it's a great locale for academia and journalism. It's a great setting. Um, I would. I began the Media Beat as a newspaper column. I was asked by Tribune newspapers when they started a daily newspaper in New York. Quite a brave venture back in 2004, 20 years ago, to almost to the day. It was an election campaign. The campaign then was between George W. Bush and John Kerry. And I had the job of examining the media and critiquing it and praising it when it was doing well and criticizing it when it was not. Um, and I guess over time, I've established uh, a range of ways to judge the work of my peers without being, you know, superior about it. I'm just older than a lot of practicing journalists now, and I think I've got some wealth of experience to base my judgments on. I turned the newspaper column became a radio show, which it still is, and I still turn out the column online. Not not on a weekly basis as I used to. It's more periodic than that. But you're right. At one point, I was trying to discuss the possibility of Kamala Harris picking a useful and helpful uh, running mate for her ticket. And like a lot of journalists, I fixed on a line that I thought was promising, and I didn't actually predict this, but I just commented that Mark Kelly seemed to have a lot of very good qualifications to be the running mate for Kamala Harris, and someone else ended up. But that happens in journalism all the time. Tim Walz is an interesting choice too. One of the interesting things about the Democratic Party at the moment is that they have a very deep bench skillful and characterful and reliable politicians. That's not something you can say about every political grouping in this country, but I think that Democrats are sort of fortunate in that, in having that strong base of well-equipped men and women who know how to serve, how know how to be public servants, and have good qualities. And and one of the interesting things is that when you construct a campaign, and of course critical to that is ensuring that you have a balanced ticket at the top of the ticket. Um, and in this case, I think some careful effort has been made to balance that city versus rural balance that I talked about, and you've been referring to just now. I think that Tim Walz is going to show his qualities under a microscope, I guess, when he talks with his opposite number, debates with his opposite number, J.D. Vance. And we're talking now before that debate, but I have a strong feeling that it's going to be a very interesting and revealing debate.
If you were to make a prediction, and I know that's not your field, but if you were to make a idea of what you think will be said or going on in this debate, because the debate will be tomorrow, it'll be on October 1st, what are you looking for? And as a journalist, what are you looking for to see in that debate?
Well, one thing I have learned in all these decades of experience that I was just bragging about is that you journalists should not make predictions. It's as simple as that. What I'll be looking for is how the two candidates at that level, at the VP level, the vice presidential level, will be tackling matters of the cost of living and other issues such as immigration. And I know that those are two areas that they'll be strongly opposed to each other. And I want to see how skillfully or otherwise they conceive the issues as being, and how they address each other's points. Because I think here is an opportunity for good and useful and constructive political debate. Whether we get it or not is an open question, because, of course, the quality of political discourse these days has plummeted. Right? I think. I mean, that's my personal opinion. The rancor and the bitterness of political debate now is harmful to the political process, and I hope that these two gentlemen will be just that, gentlemen with each other, and conduct a discussion which is decent, and it'll doubtless be strong. I mean, I hope it's strong and pointed, but I hope it's not rancorous.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and everything. One of the things that I've been very much concerned about, I don't know if you've been concerned about it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts around it, is I mentioned my parents' radio station and everything, but there has been a push both in newspaper and in television toward the corporatization of those entities and everything, because a lot of things are very much corporate run. I think in radio it's like basically four basic stations that run everything, whether it's Clear Channel or Radio One or a number of other ones. Live Nation might fit in there, but and I say probably the same can be said around journalism with Knight Ritter and some of the other big houses and everything. But I'm just wondering how much is that, as a journalist yourself, as well as a professor in the media, are you concerned about? Because that's something that I sometimes get fearful of, is this notion of there being like these large monopolies in the media space.
Yes, well, the coalescence of ownership is a very distressing phenomenon, and it's getting close to being what you just named it, monopoly, and the narrowing down of ownership of the means of communication of news is a very distressing phenomenon. The more voices we have, the more truthful voices we have, the more voices dedicated to discovering the truth and broadcasting it, the better. but at the moment the opposite is happening, and that's to be regretted. And I hope the more and more independent channels should I mean could, given the technology of today, could be springing up, and I hope they do, and I hope that they carry those basic principles of finding out the truth and broadcasting it to the fullest extent.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Couple of things I wanted to get to that I are very much lover of, and it seems like you are as well. As I looked at Media Beat, but I am a big fan because we have a big festival here in Durham, North Carolina, called the Full Frame Festival of Documentaries. And I know that one of the pieces you wrote was about documentaries and also how some of them can be biased in their own ways and everything. So I just wanted your take on the state of documentaries in general and whether you are still a fan of documentaries. Because, like I said, I know that it used to be called Double Take, but now it's been Full Frame for a number of years, and it's kind of our documentary version of Sundance, where a lot of documentarians come from around the world to Durham and descend. A couple of years we missed because of COVID, but I think this year coming up it'll be back again. It's now been back, I think, for 2 or 3 years. But I just wanted your take on documentaries and their importance in the media landscape.
Well, I'm a big fan of documentaries. I mean, who wouldn't be if you've spent most of your life making them, as I have? But it's such a broad category, Mark, and there's so many different kinds of ways of making documentaries. It would be very foolish of me to generalize. When I see a good documentary, it's a bit like an elephant. You don't quite know how to describe it, but you certainly recognize it when you see it. And A good documentary I mean, you know it's good when it gets hold of you and carries you and persuades you. And there are many good documentaries like that being made. I also see a lot of stuff purporting to be documentary, where often it's very self-indulgent and is all dedicated to promulgating the feelings, usually feelings more than thoughts, of people who feel that the world is owed their thoughts and feelings, and very often the world would probably be a better place without them. Uh, but uh, but of course, we have a First Amendment in this country, and freedom of expression is a cherished notion, and I cherish it too. So people have an absolute right to make whatever documentary they want to make. I also have the absolute right to turn it off if it's not appealing to me, if I'm watching it on television, or walk out of the theatre if it's showing in a theatre. Um, but on the whole, I think it's still a vibrant communications form, and a lot of people are doing really good work in it.
How much are you worried about? Because it's come up on this network. We have Rick Rosner that used to work for Jimmy Kimmel on our new show, and he's got his own show that he airs about once a month or something like that, which is a point counterpoint kind of show. Which is he's very much on the left. His friend who's an artist is very much on the right, and they kind of go back and forth on a show called Naked at Night and everything because it's a late night show, and he's being posed in a picture and all along those lines and everything. But I know he talks about AI, and I know that one of your pieces talks about AI as well. And I do know that even Hollywood's screenwriters were concerned about AI. So I'm just wondering how much do journalists like you and me need to be worried about AI coming and taking our jobs or making our jobs even better and everything. So what is your thoughts around AI and computers and the way that they are being developed?
Well, AI is a tool. Um, it's neutral in the sense that it's neither bad nor good, in my view. It's all a matter of how it's used. And in the end, the purpose with which it's being applied, and it's being applied by a human being. You can't have a documentary made by AI, just the machine doing it itself. Human guidance is involved in this, and the ethical base, the ethical approach of the human being in charge of the AI is what's going to determine whether or not this is an honest and purposeful piece of work being put out. I don't think we can make a prediction about how good or otherwise AI is going to be for the whole field of media. It'll depend entirely on the human beings who are using it.
Yeah, that makes sense. What is a story that you wish was covered more by mainstream media and everything. I mean, there are certain stories that we know are covered all the time, and certainly they're covered for good reasons. I mean, there's definitely lots of coverage around Israel, lots of coverage around what's going on in Ukraine, and of course, now lots of coverage around, like I said earlier, the politics of the United States and even the political divide. And I would even argue that climate change is in the news regularly. But having friends that are from African and Asian nations, I sometimes don't hear about as much of their countries and stories as I would like and everything, and even some of the things that are covered. Like I wish that people, even in our minority press, would cover some of the scientists and people that are doing work that are in those communities, and see if sometimes even those presses don't do a great job of covering some of the advances going on even in their own communities. That's just my own personal thoughts. But I was wondering, what are some stories that you wish would be covered more than they are actually being covered?
Well, I think that much of the American media, not all of it, I have hasten to add, but much of the American media are a little insular. America's own concerns, own politics, its own stresses and strains seem to occupy the American media a lot disproportionately. Let's put it that way. There's a whole world out there. It's an obvious point to make, but there is a whole world out there which is not American and is not like America. And seeing more reporting of that would be all to the good, in my view. And the other thing is that journalism in general in America, I feel I ought to put in a plug for history. I think the degree to which uh, the sense of a shared memory is ignored so much in American media. The importance of recalling the origins of whatever story you're telling at the moment is often left on the side, and I know it's difficult. There's always a pressure on space in newspapers and time in broadcasting and on the web, but it's always worth the effort, I think, to just take a moment when you're telling a story to explain what the background is, what the origins of this issue were. It always helps the understanding in the end.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Everything that's part of what I do. I kind of alluded to it earlier, and definitely on some other shows. I can't remember if I did it on this one or not. But one of the places I work at is a cultural arts center here in Durham. It's actually one of the longest running African American cultural arts centers. It will celebrate its 50th year next year, called the Hayti Heritage Center. And over the last 2 to 3 years, because one of our historians passed away, I have had that role kind of descended on me and everything. So we have a lady that does a more theatrical kind of tour of that history, and that's part of what we are doing is adding context, not just talking about a Black Wall Street, but also showing why Mr. Duke. Speaking of UNC, there's Duke University here in Durham, and he's got a bigger stained glass than the two Jesus Christs and everything. So we have to talk about that in that historical context of how he was approached and how he got that money, and then after giving the money, was wanting to have a moment of ego, as I like to put it, when I'm doing my history talks and everything and other things, because we all have our vanity moments. Trump wasn't the first one. Everybody has their vanity moments. So I love to talk about that history element. And I agree with you that we don't hear enough of that conversation and all in that space. So I was just wondering, how would you add the historical element if you could do it in either newspapers or television? Because I also know a lot of people, even our one of our two founders talks about that if it leads kind of attitude that unfortunately a number of our TV stations have, whether they're there in New York, whether you are, or whether they're here in Durham, or whether they're in Athens, Ohio, wherever they may be, and everything. But how can we get out of that mindset and maybe bring some more of the historical components?
Well, I don't know, frankly, Mark. But what I should know, what I should say, is I should make a nod to Chapel Hill, where you are. One of the great guides to me in the business of documentary making and journalism in general, because I've always carried his words with me, and that's John Hope Franklin
Mm-hmm.
at Duke University, emeritus professor of history, a splendid, wonderful man. And he always told me that I must tell the truth. Obviously, well, I say obviously, not everybody wants to tell the truth, and he said it's very important that we weed out the people who want to tell the truth from those who don't want to tell the truth, and it's one of my jobs as a journalist to do that. But in my own work, I want to hold to the idea that, like John Hope Franklin, I want to discover the whole truth, as much of the whole truth as I possibly can, and tell the truth as fully as I can, roundedly, with history, because history is important, as I just said, and with a sense of what its significance might be for the community that's reading or listening or watching the work that I produce in the end.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know if you've ever had the pleasure. I did know John Hope Franklin when he was living and had some friends that knew him even better than I did. One of my good friends is actually his for lack of a better term, play son, a guy by the name of Buna Ndiaye, who was from Senegal and everything along those lines. But he was actually one of his not natural sons because he does have his own kids and everything, but like a person that mentored him and still considers him to be one of his father figures or Baba figures and all along those lines. But I know several of his friends, including Buna and Brett Chambers, have told me because Brett actually wanted to, if I remember, I think it was Brett wanted to do a documentary. But John Hope Franklin apparently had a very beautiful orchid collection. So I don't know if you ever had the chance to see that beautiful orchid
I
collection.
have walked amongst those orchids and smelled them and touched them. It was a wonderful experience, and his care of those orchids really seemed emblematic to me, almost symbolic of someone who was carefully nurturing what he needed to nurture. And many students were nurtured by him in terms of their approach to history and their retelling of history.
Well, there's no doubt about that. I think that Mark Anthony Neal, who I know quite well and is a professor now over at Duke, would say that John Hope Franklin was probably one of his mentors and one of the people that has helped him go. And he does a lot of research around hip hop and other things. And one of my cousins, I think it's a distant cousin, maybe second or third, is actually involved in a controversial issue, and I was just going to wonder your thoughts around it. But he is a Duke professor and a history professor. Some people are glad to hear what he's involved with. Other people are not as glad. But Sandy Darity and Kristen Mullins, but more Sandy, is directly related to me. Like I said, I think it's either second or third cousin. I think it's mom's second, which would be my third if I remember the lineage correctly. But he's been involved in the reparation struggle for a number of years and everything. So I just wanted your take, just in general, on that kind of conversation, because I know that's something else that's been in the media, including out in California, where people have been trying to decide whether it's something that should happen or not happen. But I just wondered, as a journalist, what your own personal opinions are, if you've got any.
It's an important debate to have, and one of the interesting things is that in Britain too, we have a long imperial history, and it's becoming a vital matter of discussions there too. What is the right and appropriate way to make reparations? And it needn't necessarily be money, but there are all sorts of ways for the wrongs of history to be righted. And most people's interest in history ends up pointing to that question. When there were terrible things done in history, how can they be remedied in the present? And those are really important discussions to have.
Yeah. Along those same lines, I'm not going to hold you up that much longer because I know that your publicist had told me you give me about an hour, maybe an hour, a little bit over. And I know we're over the hour mark, so I don't want to hold you up too much longer and everything. But I would
I do
just,
have to go, I'm afraid. I do have to go, but please
yeah,
go on.
and that's what I
We'll
figured.
be we'll be brief, right?
That's why I was going to wrap it up and everything. But just really quickly, as we wrap up and everything, what is your thoughts around the notion of people's worrying about the nations going one side of politics or another? Because I know that even in Europe, there's been a lot of conversation about how the countries seem to be moving toward the right of politics, and there's even been that conversation to some degree here in the United States as well. But I just wanted your take on this notion of, I guess, it's nationalism, and in some cases, even other terms that have been used, as well as populism and all in that phrase. But I'm just wondering, in your own journalistic observations, what you have noticed.
Well, it's a tough time. It's in We've had election results in Austria this week. I've been writing over the last few months about very disturbing trends in European politics, where the far right, extreme violent right, sometimes are gaining headway, and it's very easy to see parallels here in the United States, and it's very disturbing, uh, and that's why I'm a great believer in factual journalism that tells it how it really is, and corrects, works to correct at least some of the wild accusations made by all sides, really. But there's something peculiarly frightening about those people who believe they have the truth and are convinced that if you don't believe the same way as they do, then somehow or other they've got the right to cancel you, to perhaps even, in extreme cases, wipe you out. That's the kind of politics which we fought the Second World War to defeat and to put behind us. And yet here it seems to be returning. And it's really important to keep our eyes open and be very determined about what's permissible and what's not permissible in the public square.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think that anything's going to happen with Eric Adams? Because you just mentioned you're in New York, and I know that he's saying that he's going to stay and fight and everything along those lines. Where there are people like AOC that are telling him to step down, and I've heard that whoever may replace him may be even further to the left and everything. But what is your take on Eric Adams and these latest indictments?
Well, Eric Adams is an innocent man until he's proved otherwise. Let the courts of law take the due process and deal with him. Whether or not, in this situation, he's capable of still executing the duties of the position he holds is a different question, and that's entirely up to him.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, on that note, as we're heading out the door, if you want to tell folks how they can reach you, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, David, and I wish we had more time and everything, and hopefully I can get you to come back in the not too distant future. Because, like I said, as a fellow journalist and as somebody that has definitely had more seasoned experience, not trying to knock your age, because I am 62, so I'm not exactly a spring chicken either at everything, but definitely would love to have some of the experiences that you've had, and definitely would love to learn more at your feet as a student of journalism, and definitely all in that space. But if there are things that you want to share about how you can be reached about your particular book, A Question of Fraternity, and like I said, I'll reach out to Lisa, but I hope that we can have you come back on Pod TV on this show or some of my other shows, because I do know you prefer the one-on-ones and I don't mind the one-on-ones as well. But I hope that we can have further conversation in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Mark. Well, you can get the book, A Question of Paternity, at Amazon, and you can see my work on a regular basis at themediabeat.com.
Well, like I said, I definitely appreciate you. I think I'm going to go out with a PSA that I've got here about mental health and the importance about the mental health, because I know that that's an important issue as well. So before I play this PSA and as we get ready to head out the door and everything, if you've got any thoughts about just the importance of mental health for our young listeners and listeners in general, because I do know that that is an issue that whether you're a veteran or a person in journalism or a number of other things, people are always concerned about. So if you want to just give some thoughts around mental health, and I'll play the mental health PSA and bounce us both on out of here on this particular show. But any thoughts that you have around the importance of mental health?
Do I have any thoughts about mental
Yes.
health?
Yeah, before I play the PSA.
Uh, well, that's a difficult one to answer, except to say that mental health is important. It sounds banal to say that, but a lot of time we tend to dismiss it as somehow a fringe matter. It's not. Good mental health is essential to us all, and more openness about the state of our mental health is important too. Too many people, I think I'm right in saying, more Americans that I know than ones I don't know. Well, this is probably the wrong way to say this, but let me phrase it another way. I know too many Americans in particular, and British people in particular too, who don't want to talk about the state of their mental condition, who want to keep it secret. And as I said in relation to my own family history, family secrets are toxic. And they need to be opened up as much as they possibly can. And if that involves a history of mental illness, well, we should talk about that as well.
I definitely agree with you, and I think that that's what these young people say on this particular PSA as well. And like I said, David, I have thoroughly enjoyed this hour and 10-minute conversation. I do hope that I get a chance to talk to you again in the not too distant future. But this has definitely been enjoyable and I hope informative as well. And I hope that I did not disappoint you as a fellow journalist and all along those lines. But definitely look forward to having more conversations with you in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Mark.
No problem.
I just need to be left alone right now, man.
No, Cam. I think the problem is that you've been left alone way too much.
Life's hard. The world is complicated.
Remember, you are not alone.
Love you, girl. I love you too.
Mental health challenges are common, treatable, and often preventable.
It's time to talk about it.
It's time to defy the fear and stigma that has made so many suffer in silence.
Instead, dare to love yourself and others.
Dare to ask for help and support.
I love you guys.
Dare to listen and show up for the people around you.
Join the conversation.